Hey everybody, Brad Geiger here with another episode of Webcomics Confidential, and today I'd like to talk about Patreon strategy. These are some strategies that you can apply to your Patreon approach, and I think having a few of these thoughts in your mind using some of these strategies is going to help you do better on Patreon. First thing I want to discuss is this, and I'll put it up right here on the screen. If you go to any of Patreon's seminars or meetups, they're going to put this image in front of you. And this is the spectrum of Patreon support. On the left-hand side, you'll see that it's very much weighted towards altruism. This is Patreon backers who just want to support the thing that you do, and they don't expect a whole lot in return for that. They like what you do, and they want to support that. And of course, it goes through all the spectrum of giving until you get all the way to the right, and that is exclusive content. That's a subscription-based Patreon. That's where you're putting exclusive content on Patreon, and your backer has to be a Patreon backer in order to see that exclusive content. In other words, it's a subscription. They've got to pay to see the content. Now, what does that mean to you? Well, here's a few things to keep in mind. Number one, that far left side of the spectrum is fantastic. And to be fair, it should be a part of everyone's Patreon approach. If it's the sum total of your Patreon approach, you may have problems. And here's why. That approach is only going to work if you have a huge following. If you've got a huge readership, if you have a huge number of people who like your work, then this support approach is going to work great for you. Because if you have 1 million followers who are actively following your stuff, if you just convert 1% of them to become Patreon backers at your lowest tier, then that's going to translate into a good income for you. Here's the problem. Not a lot of us have that kind of followings. Let's face it, even some of the people that we see on Instagram that have millions of followers or hundreds of thousands of followers, we know when we take a look at their Patreons that they're not doing a good job of converting those followers into Patreon backers. And there's a number of reasons for that, one of which I suspect is that a lot of those followers on Instagram may not be real followers. They may be bots, or I see that myself in my own Instagram account. How many people following me aren't really people? That may be problematic, and also it may be endemic to the overall culture on Instagram, which is very much not very accustomed to showing them an ad or getting them to get involved in crowdfunding. And that's a topic that we can talk about at a later time. However, suffice it to say, for right now, for what we're talking about, the far left of the spectrum, the support side of the spectrum, the altruism, the I just want to support you because I like what you do, that is only going to work for you if you have really, really large numbers of actual followers. Okay? For the rest of us, me included, we're going to scoot over towards the right-hand side of that spectrum, and we're going to be motivated more by exclusive content or things that just our backers get or get a special access to. So here's what we need to think about. Exclusive content works really well for Patreon backers, especially if they're highly motivated to get that content. Exclusive content is really going to be the thing for you if you don't have really high numbers. And there's a lot of ways to approach this. You can do certain things like offering a free comic on the web and then offering a premium version of that comic, or having certain parts of that storyline scoot off into your Patreon. You may have a whole separate title that's exclusive to Patreon. So as you're doing your public-facing webcomic, you say, oh, by the way, I've got this other thing that I'm doing, and it's on Patreon. It's exclusive, and you've got to be a Patreon backer to get it. There's all kinds of ways to approach exclusive content. Number one, it should be digital. All right, shipping physical mailing of Patreon rewards is a real risky business, especially if the thing that you're shipping cannot be packed flat and shipped cheaply. In other words, postcards, prints, stuff like this, that's plausible. That's a potential Patreon reward. Stuff like books, things that you've got to pay larger amounts to ship, especially as I know you can ship books media mail here in the States, but you have to realize you're going to be dealing with overseas shipping when you start to deal with Patreon, and that overseas shipping is going to kill you. Okay, if you can't pack it flat, it's probably not a good candidate for a physical reward. I only have one physical reward in my Patreon campaign, and you've got to pay the equivalent of $60 in Patreon pledges to get that. And it's something that I can ship flat. All right. I don't mess around with any physical rewards except at the upper levels of my tiers. I handle it as a $20 pledge. Every 3 pledges, you get the reward. I won't handle any Patreon pledges that are physical rewards in any other circumstances. It's got to be the higher tiers. And the reason for that is, quite frankly, just shipping costs. Shipping is going to kill you. So no physical rewards. The good news is people really do appreciate digital rewards. And there's a lot of digital rewards that you can offer. The top level is just an exclusive comic, a comic that you have to be a Patreon backer to even see. That's very powerful if the comic has demand. All right, if the comic is good, if it has demand, and you make it an exclusive, people will sign up for it. There's also other things you can do. Collections, digital collections of your archives. Sketchbooks are very powerful. There's a lot of digital rewards that you can offer that will bring in Patreon backers. Remember, however, once you get into this mindset, if you want somebody to have a monthly pledge, you have to be giving them a monthly reward. In other words, this deal where you say when you sign up, you get a free copy of my book. All right. But that's only something you can deliver once every 6 months, maybe once every year. If you want a monthly pledge, you need to deliver a monthly reward. So whatever you put in that slot, you have to make sure that you're able to come through with it month after month after month. Let's face it, your Patreon backer, once they get their reward, has very little incentive to stay if they're not getting rewarded month after month. Let's face it, they're paying month after month. They need a reward month after month. And that brings me to my next point. When you're talking about Patreon, when you're writing the words for your Patreon page, when you're on social media talking about Patreon, unless you have the kind of numbers in which you are able to do a support-based Patreon, if you can do that charity-based Patreon where your numbers of followers are so great that you're doing wonderful with just 1%, unless that's you need to be very careful about how you talk about Patreon to the outside world. You cannot use charity language. Because if you do, it's going to come back and set up a very difficult psychological relationship between you and your backer. If you set up a charity relationship, you run the risk of having a situation like this. And a lot of people have reported this, okay? They say they start seeing Patreon backers cancel their pledge once they notice that the artist is doing really well. They say, well, I signed up to help you, but you're doing well now, at least maybe well in terms of what the backer thinks is well. They say, you're doing well now, you don't need my help anymore, so I'm canceling my pledge. And so you see Patreon creators getting punished for their success. Their numbers get high, and then their backers start backing out. Which is what we don't want backers to do. That's not why we call them backers. They start backing out because they say, oh, you don't need our help anymore. My theory is, I really strongly believe this, the problem that was caused by that is that the Patreon creator set up a charity relationship between themselves and their backers. And in a charity, it's very easy to say, well, you don't need my help anymore, right? That's why I say avoid charity language at all costs, unless you're running a true charity Patreon. Avoid charity language. Instead, focus on community. You'll never hear me say, thank you for your generous donation. That's charity language. Okay? You'll never hear me say words like support me on Patreon, or very rarely will you see that kind of words like support and donation. Words like that where I thank you for your gift. Okay? No, when I talk about Patreon in the outside world, I'm using words like join us on Patreon. Those words emphasize community. I'm saying I've got this community that I've set up over here. We're having great fun. You should get in on it. That's the kind of language that I use to talk about Patreon in the outside world. I say, hey, look at what my Patreon backers are getting. It's like I've set up a clubhouse off to the side, and you can join. You can be a part of that. And the buy-in is very little, but you have to pay a little bit of something at the door. There is a cost of admission, like all places that are worth getting into. They don't let you get into Disney World for free. It's a wonderful place. They don't let you get in for free. Same thing with my Patreon. It's a wonderful place. You can't get in for free. Okay? There is a cost of admission, and that cost is very manageable. And for the different types of access that you get, it's commensurate. But I've created a clubhouse. It's over here on Patreon. You should join because we are having lots of fun. It's an exclusive community that you can join. When I talk about Patreon, I talk about it in terms of community and exclusivity. There's something going on there that you'd like, and it's exclusive. Okay? Not charity talk, not generous support, nothing like that. Join us on Patreon. I emphasize community. Finally, and somewhat relatedly, you have to also be careful when you're talking about Patreon, specifically when you're building your Patreon page, when you're doing that write-up on your Patreon page that explains what you're doing. Be very careful. A lot of creators fall into this trap. When they talk about Patreon, they talk about what's in it for me, right? If you become a Patreon backer, I get to quit my day job. If you become a Patreon backer, I get to buy new equipment. If you become a Patreon backer, I get to work on this comic that I want to work on. They talk about what's in it for me. It's egocentric. What's in it for me? Remember, your Patreon backers are just like you. Now think about it. When you give somebody money, you expect something in return. Everybody does. Nobody just goes around throwing money willy-nilly, except like we were talking about in a charity sense. Then what's in it for you is a warm feeling, okay? But by and large, 99% of your spending habits, when you give $1 over, you expect $1's worth back. And better yet, it's always great when you get $2 worth back. Okay? Your Patreon backers are no different than you. That's why your Patreon page should focus on what's in it for them. What do they get when they become a Patreon backer? They get exclusive comics. They get exclusive access. They get stuff that they wouldn't get otherwise. And it's really great if the perceived value of that is higher than the money value. And that's easy to do. You can apply values to everything that you're giving. And that value is what you give it, right? If I say that this sketchbook is $10, it's $10. If I give it to you for $5, you just made a $5 bargain. Even if the sketchbook doesn't have an actual value of that, I gave it that value. That's perceived value, okay? And it also helps if the quality is high enough that helps to bolster that perception. But remember, everything has a perceived value. And if you can convince your Patreon backers that they're actually getting more in perceived value than they're handing over in actual money, you've got a winning Patreon. That's a Patreon campaign that's going to go for days, okay? So talk about what's in it for them. What do they get? Not what do you get. What do they get when they become your Patreon backer? That's what you've got to focus on. Milestones are great, and it's a separate topic. Milestones saying when we get to this level, then this certain thing will happen. That's a perfectly good place to put that other conversation about stuff like new equipment and stuff like that. That's fine. But in general, when you're talking about Patreon, you need to tell your backers what's in it for them. At the end of the day, most of us are going to be running a Patreon campaign in which we are going to be offering exclusive content to one extent or another. Whether it's exclusive access, a fully exclusive comic that nobody else can read, or exclusive access to things like archives, which is something that we really ought to be considering as a webcomics community. And I'll talk more about that in an upcoming Webcomics Confidential. But most of us are going to be handling exclusives. That takes a very deft touch. It means not doing charity language. It means talking about what's in it for the backer. It means understanding what an exclusive is. It's got a lot of potential. It can really help your Patreon grow, but you need to be a little bit cognizant of how you're pitching it to your potential backers. If you've got any thoughts, any questions, any comments, hit those comments below. Let me know what you're thinking. This is Brad Geiger for Webcomics Confidential, and as always, I hope you have a creative day.